in my head, I'm thinking too, a big part of the story stimulus here for me is once that World Cup ended in Qatar, I was like, okay, great. Well, the next one's going to be so much more normal. We're going to a country where there's so much more infrastructure. Like, so we got all the stadia in place. Don't have to worry about that as much. And how intensely wrong I was in that sort of thought
Yeah,
process.
yeah.
This
Well,
isn't going to be
but
normal
we
at
all
all.
are.
When the World Cup in Qatar in 2022 came to a close, I had two initial thoughts. The first one was how insane that final was. Argentina beat France on penalties after the game finished 3-3. Lionel Messi and Kylian Mbappe both scored, and Emi Martinez made one of the most important saves of all time, and then did whatever this was. And the whole thing finished with Gonzalo Montiel, a defensive sub who came on at the beginning of extra time, scoring the winning goal to get Argentina and Messi the trophy. So that was the first thought, something along the lines of, holy shit, that was incredible, and I think I might need to go lie down now. But once that dopamine high wore off, the second thought was a little more complicated. Because going back to when it was awarded to Qatar in 2010, the conversation around that tournament had been pretty tough. That World Cup was fraught with problems in a way that no other before it had ever been, and that's saying something. It may have been fun, but it certainly wasn't easy. And almost as soon as that final in Doha ended, all I could think was, man, thank God we're not going to have to worry about all that next time. Fast forward to 4 years later, and it turns out that in 2026, we are in fact worrying about all that next time. If you turn on any World Cup coverage right now, it's just as likely to be a story about ticket prices or Donald Trump as it is about the actual football. And that got me thinking, not just about what went wrong or how we got here, but about something a lot more fundamental about this tournament. What is the World Cup actually for? Like, the cost of this tournament is going to run into the tens of billions, and something like 70% of the entire world population is going to watch it in some capacity. There's got to be some reason that we keep doing this. Going back to its inception, the World Cup has always had two competing souls. One of them believes, genuinely, that football can do something to people that almost nothing else can. That it can connect them across borders and languages and all the other stuff that usually keeps people apart. That idea goes all the way back to the man who created this tournament, a guy named Jules Rimet, who fought in the First World War and came home and decided to build something that might help prevent the next one. But then there's the other part, which looked at all of that and said, yeah, okay, but also think about how much money you could make.
The teaming up of the three major North American countries was very much a strategic move. The United States, Canada, and Mexico were all three going to submit their own bids. This is just how they worked out. They would all profit.
On June 11th, 2026, the World Cup will begin with host Mexico playing South Africa in Mexico City. I mean, I say host Mexico, that term is a lot broader at this tournament than it has been at any of the other ones so far. In pretty much every way, actually, this is going to be the biggest World Cup ever. This tournament is going to be the first one to have 48 teams in it, a pretty huge jump from the 32-team format that had been in place since 1998, and double what it was for the other World Cups in North America. It's also a big tournament because of the geography. Getting across 3 countries is already a lot to think about, but for some of these teams, getting across those 3 countries is going to require a lot of time in the air. England, for instance, plays their first group game against Croatia in Dallas, and then 6 days later plays their second against Ghana in Boston, almost 2,000 miles away. And we're kind of used to that in the US. Like, the Dallas Cowboys play in the same division as teams in New York and Philadelphia, which doesn't really make any sense, but they do that kind of stuff all the time. But especially after Qatar, where the whole thing took place within a radius of like 40 miles, this is going to feel like the games are happening on different planets. Which is a bit of a choice for an organization that's made a big deal about cutting down on their carbon emissions, but whatever. Whether you're a player or a journalist or even a fan, you'll literally need a passport to get from one game to the next. And in the whole history of the World Cup, which spans almost 100 years now, that's only happened one other time. I had to learn a lot about the history of the World Cup for this video, most of which came from one book, just The Power and the Glory by Jonathan Wilson. Reading it kind of felt like watching all of the previous episodes of a show before the final season comes out, but if you're trying to learn about the history of the World Cup, there really isn't a better resource out there. And that includes the only World Cup in history to have more than one host. 2002 in South Korea, and Japan.
It's only the second time we've had co-hosts. It's the first time we've had 3 hosts. That creates problems. And you look at South Korea and Japan in 2002, in a sense, that was 2 parallel tournaments that went on simultaneously, and then the winners of each met in the final. Then they're not really, it almost doesn't feel like the same tournament.
And there's a very good reason for that. Neither one of those countries wanted to share the World Cup. Japan and Korea originally submitted 2 completely separate bids, only for them to be combined at the very last minute. FIFA President João Havelange had been publicly and privately supporting the Japan bid, only for the Koreans, backed by UEFA, to throw their hat in the ring and bring the whole thing to an impasse. In the end, the 2 federations were essentially voluntold to co-host the tournament, which created a whole bunch of logistical issues and a lot of bitterness between 2 countries who historically didn't need a ton of help in that department. And out of that came some of the pettiest behavior in the history of organized sports. The organizers of the tournament from the different sides barely talked to each other. At the opening ceremonies in Seoul, there was basically no mention of Japan being involved at all. And then my favorite detail from FIFA Vice President Chung Mong-jun, who was also co-chairman of South Korea's organizing committee, and evidently a world-class rage baiter.
He lobbies to have the official language of a tournament to be French. And everybody's a bit baffled by this. And then they realize the only major European language in which the word for Korea comes alphabetically before the word for Japan is French. So it's officially, Le Mondial Korea-Japon. So Korea gets to go first.
It's so petty, and I love it so much. But all that to say that countries co-hosting the World Cup hasn't happened very often, and when it has, they haven't really super enjoyed it. And yet, when the hosts of this tournament submitted their bid book, which is basically a very long PowerPoint presentation on what a potential World Cup would look like, the first slide on it was this, which is more than a little ironic for a couple of different reasons. The first tournament in history to cover 3 separate countries definitely wasn't just 3 completely separate bids getting smooshed together. And there definitely wouldn't be the same kind of infighting that had happened in 2002 between 3 countries who were traditional allies. These guys get along great. No issues there whatsoever. All 3 of these stated aims seemed very attainable at the time. But that bid was approved in 2018, and a lot has happened since. Leander Charlekens is a soccer writer for The Guardian, as well as a professor of sports media at Marist University in New York. Go Red Foxes! And he recently wrote a book called The Long Game, which is a history of the United States men's national team, which we will be referring back to multiple times in this video. There's also a link in the description to this one and Jonathan Wilson's book. They're both very good. You should totally check both of them out. Leander has been covering the build-up to this tournament extensively, and has noticed that the vibe around this World Cup has shifted quite a bit from what it was meant to be originally.
It's definitely not played out the way the bid book promised, with unity and all that. Given that the United States has threatened to annex one co-host and invade the other co-host, while at the same time there's this increasingly obvious asymmetry in how much time Infantino has spent with these heads of state, right? He was at the Kennedy Center, or as it's now called, I guess, the Trump Kennedy Center, for the opening of the Melania documentary, right? Like, he is showing up to everything that he can that Donald Trump is going to be at, whereas he has hardly spent any time with the Canadian Prime Minister or the Mexican president.
At some level, yes, football can bring people together, both figuratively and literally. But that's sort of in spite of how these big institutions behave, not really because of it. And I definitely don't think that it has the borderline magical effect on people's thoughts and feelings that FIFA and Infantino seem to think it does. At the time of the tournament starting, 2 of the competing nations are in direct military conflict with each other, which I don't think has ever happened before. 4 of the participating nations currently either have full or partial travel bans placed on them by the country hosting 80% of the matches. And I don't think that any of that is going to be suddenly made better by the fact that the World Cup is happening. So is unity the point of this tournament? Are we actually doing this to try and bring people together? I don't think so, and if we are, I don't think it's working particularly well. It might be if you listen to Gianni Infantino, but he's using that language for a very deliberate reason. It's all a part of FIFA's branding. He's invoking the ideas of Jules Rimet and of what the World Cup used to mean, even if it definitely doesn't mean that anymore.
I mean, sort of underlying this whole conversation we're having is, why on earth is America doing this? Why does it want the World Cup? It's not going to, well, maybe the ticket price is so high it will make a profit. I don't know. But why has Trump attached himself to the tournament in such a big way?
As has already been mentioned, the 2026 World Cup is the first in history to have 3 different hosts. But what are those hosts actually getting out of it? According to The Independent's Miguel Delaney, there are 2 main purposes for giving a country the World Cup. They're usually either recognizing the football culture of a more traditional country like Germany or Brazil, or taking the game to countries where the goal is to develop a football culture, like in Qatar. And it's pretty clear to see where Mexico and Canada fit into that dynamic. Mexico is very much a traditional football country. They've already hosted 2 World Cups in 1970 and 1986, and are tied with Italy for the 3rd most appearances at the World Cup for any country. Canada is on the other end of the spectrum. They've only been to 2 World Cups before this one, but they're also one of the fastest growing football countries in the world, and this tournament will presumably only make that stronger. But where does the US fit into that? We are neither a traditional power nor a true up-and-comer, so what's in it for us in terms of hosting this tournament? Well, whether you like it or not, the answer to that probably comes down to the thoughts and feelings of one guy.
The fact that Trump was the head of state when the bid was won and when the tournament was to be staged is very unusual. It's only happened twice before post-war. Once was in 1986 when Miguel de Madrid was president of Mexico. The other one is Putin. And okay, technically he was prime minister in 2010, but he was head of state. We know the reality of that. Because of Trump having non-consecutive terms, it's a very unusual situation.
Donald Trump is the variable in all this that no one could have accounted for. At least in part because they didn't think they needed to. The World Cup was awarded to North America in June 2018, about a year and a half into Trump's first term in office. If you don't know how the American electoral system works, the president can only serve 2 4-year terms. So by 2026, he should have been out of there, one way or another. The only way he would be in charge during the World Cup would be if he lost in 2020 and won in 2024, which would have made him just the 2nd president in America's 250-year history to serve 2 non-consecutive terms. And surely that wasn't going to happen.
Decision Desk HQ can now project that former President Donald Trump will be our next president.
Turns out that was exactly what happened. The U.S. Soccer Federation has goals for this World Cup, and we'll get into some of those later. But as for the U.S. as a country, the agenda appears to be being set by the man in charge of it. In March 2025, President Trump established the World Cup Task Force, chaired by Trump himself, with the stated aim of, quote, ensuring the successful hosting of world-class international events that reflect the values, security, and hospitality of the United States of America. And if you're trying to understand the United States' goals in hosting this tournament, I think it's worth taking a look at how they plan on doing that. President Trump understands the value that major sporting events like this can bring to America and is committed to leveraging these opportunities to promote American excellence. President Trump is taking every opportunity to showcase American greatness on the world stage. Hosting the 2026 FIFA World Cup will be a historic opportunity to unite the nation, celebrate American excellence, and reinforce our status as a premier global destination for major events. Pretty standard Trump stuff. But here's the thing about that. Increased visibility in putting your country in the spotlight also leads to increased scrutiny around decisions that other people might find objectionable. That's the part of this that I don't think Donald Trump has ever really thought or cared about, but probably should. On his first day in office, Trump's White House imposed 25% tariffs on both Canada and Mexico, which did not go over well at all with the future World Cup co-hosts, and sparked a trade dispute that is still going on to this day. He threatened to take over Greenland, which is still very much controlled by Denmark, who were in the running for this World Cup until the very last day of qualifying. In November 2025, Trump said that he would send in the National Guard or even try and take World Cup games away from cities he felt were unsafe or not compliant with the federal government. And then there's the coup de grace, Iran, who the US are currently at war with and only recently determined that their football team would be able to attend the tournament that it qualified for fair and square. And look, the point of this is not to just take a bunch of shots at Trump. Part of the problem is that he's more of a continuation of a theme than some kind of historical aberration. But the motivations for what the US gets out of this tournament are in his hands, and have been from the very beginning. But I also think that the Trump administration is looking for something that wasn't on the fact sheet. That's legitimacy. Not the legitimacy of America as a soccer country, but the legitimacy of Trump's policies on things like trade and immigration and security. I think that the goal is to use the World Cup as a kind of proof of concept, as a tool to validate how great not only America is, but specifically Trump's America, and his approach to running it. And how do they do that? Well, in part, by trying to distract from all that other stuff we talked about earlier with something else.
I think the reason World Cups are so valuable and the reason that they have so much power and that they're so useful to the people who try to kind of further their own agendas through them is that usually once a World Cup kicks off, everybody kind of forgets about the other stuff and about the surrounding crises and everything. You saw that in Qatar once the tournament kicked off. You know, it's all of the human rights stuff and the dead construction workers. They weren't forgotten, but it wasn't sort of front and center the way the soccer was, right? The World Cup in Russia in 2018, in Brazil in 2014, in South Africa in 2010, they were all controversial in their own ways. But then, you know, the ball starts to roll and, you know, we're really just focused on the sport, right? So in that sense, there is enormous power in sort of the way that this tournament can distract from everything that surrounds it, right? So right now, the vibes around this World Cup are really bad, right? People are worried about ticket prices. They're worried about even getting into the United States. They're worried about ICE. They're worried about being the backdrop to political blustering. There are all these things swirling around the thing. But the reason they're allowed these kind of sideshows is because ultimately the soccer is really good and really fun. And, you know, the World Cup always delivers.
That's where the real value is in this tournament to its hosts, both in this World Cup and in others. People like Donald Trump want the World Cup to deliver, of course, but they also want to show that the United States can deliver by association. That's what really matters. That's the gamble and why Trump has made himself so central to this tournament in the first place. And I believe that, not only because I think it's what the evidence suggests, but because we as Americans are not the first country to have had this idea.
The World Cup increasingly has become sort of, it's doesn't matter which country it's in, it's played in FIFA land.
Qatar versus Switzerland is a really interesting game to me because it matches up the home country of both FIFA and its president with the nation that they so controversially awarded the World Cup to in 2022. And because it gives us an opportunity to talk about what this tournament really means to the organization that puts it on. The World Cup's biggest early advocate was FIFA President Jules Rimet, the man for whom the original World Cup trophy was named, and one of the most important figures in the history of world football. In the aftermath of World War I, which he himself had fought in, Rimet thought that football might be a way to help bring the world back together. But what would that actually look like?
From the outset, what was the initial goal in terms of we're going to have a tournament, we're going to invite a bunch of countries to it? What was the idea behind that?
I think it's twofold. So let's deal with the sort of more amorphous idea first, which is Rimet has this idea of a power of football, and he has this, I think faith is the right word, a profound faith that football can be a tool for generating fraternity among different peoples, different nations, and the World Cup is part of that project. On a more practical level, you've had the football tournament at the Olympics in 24 and 28. It's enormously popular. So a third of all the receipts, all the revenues from that World Cup, from that Olympics, come from the football.
So right from the very beginning, there are these two twin pillars that are holding up both FIFA and the World Cup. On the one hand, you've got these lofty, high-minded ideas about fraternity and connecting people that come straight out of a work written by the Pope. But on the other hand, money, which brings us to this guy.
You have Gianni Infantino regularly saying, football is the world's game. This is the only game. It's for everybody. Yeah, from the poorest slum in Africa to the wealthiest palaces of the Middle East or whatever. Yeah, the ball is a magic object thing and put a smile on every face. by the way, it'll cost you $12,000 if you want to watch it. Those two things don't compute. It's the nakedness of the cynical appeals to the sort of football's power, the thing that Rime actually believed in, that Infantino is pretending to believe in, and then charging absurd prices for it.
Gianni Infantino has been FIFA president since 2016, and when he first got the job, the organization was at one of its lowest points in its 120-year history. Because there was a reason that the job was open. Infantino's predecessor, a guy named Sepp Blatter, had resigned the year before on the back of a massive corruption investigation. You might remember the story a while back about the FBI getting involved and arresting a bunch of FIFA officials. All that was part of the same deal. And Infantino, who was Secretary General of UEFA at that point, was in the perfect position to take over as the head of soccer around the world. His first job would be to get FIFA's reputation out of the toilet, which he seemed to understand in his first speech as president.
And we will restore the image of FIFA and the respect of FIFA. And everyone in the world will applaud us, and will applaud all of you for what we'll do in FIFA in the future. We have to be proud of FIFA, and everyone has to be proud of FIFA, and we have to be proud of what we will do together in FIFA. I would like to thank...
But 10 years later, has he turned FIFA into something that everyone can be proud of? I think that depends pretty heavily on who you ask, but it's hard to argue that he hasn't made a pretty big impact. Under Infantino's leadership, FIFA has essentially doubled its overall revenues, partly from expanding tournaments like both the World Cup and the Club World Cup. They've grown the Women's World Cup to a tournament that took in over $500 million in 2023. And, of course, they awarded the inaugural FIFA Peace Prize to Donald Trump in 2025. But in that same time, we've also seen Infantino's objectives and even his ambitions change pretty dramatically, from just wanting to make people proud and live up to Jules Rimet's ideals, to something very different.
Infantino's style of leadership has become increasingly sort of populist authoritarian as time's gone by. Suddenly decisions made and there's no discussion, it's just done by fiat. So if you look at, for instance, when the decision was taken to expand the tournament to 48 teams, which was early 2017, there was a committee set up. They investigated what's the best way to structure the tournament if it's 48 teams. They looked at 4 different models, and they reported back and said, look, if we have 16 groups of 3, that means we can still do the tournament within a 32-day span. I don't actually agree with them. But anyway, they had gone through some process and drawn up a report. And then suddenly, in December 2022, at the Qatar World Cup, Infantino says, actually, no, we're going to change it. We're going to have 14 groups. Hang on, but there's been no process. There's been no report. There's been no consultation. It's just done by fiat. He just announces it.
So he's a transactional, performative populist who prefers to make decisions by executive order rather than go through traditional channels. I mean, I can tell you who that doesn't not sound like. Over the past few years, Gianni Infantino and Donald Trump have formed the most bizarre and yet completely uncomplicated bromance of all time. These two guys, who could not be more different in the way they present themselves to the public, are together constantly. On the field at the Club World Cup trophy presentation, in the Oval Office announcing the World Club Task Force, at the Gaza Peace Summit, at Mar-a-Lago, at Trump's tour of the Middle East. And the natural question to ask off the back of that, in my opinion, is why is this happening? FIFA especially doesn't have to do this, and like Leander said earlier, they haven't been nearly as simpatico with the leaders of the other 2 host countries. Well, the first thing is that I think Infantino and Trump just kind of like the cut of the other one's jib. There's a genuine mutual respect and even admiration there that I think would be kind of nice in different circumstances. But there's also a more practical argument to be made that Infantino is cozying up to Trump for more utilitarian reasons.
FIFA has had to really kind of embrace the situation and, grease the skids a little bit and keep Trump happy in order to protect its cash cow. You can certainly make the argument that FIFA President Gianni Infantino has been a lot more deferential to Donald Trump than he really needed to be. But there's the counter argument is they just have to make sure that this World Cup comes off without a hitch.
It is possible that Infantino's behavior towards the president is just kind of part of the price of doing business. For this tournament to be a success, Infantino needs to get things like security guarantees and visas and coordination across the host cities. Only Trump can give him those things, and because Trump is the biggest threat to do something that would literally ruin everything, he gets the most attention. But Jonathan isn't entirely convinced by that argument, and I can't say I blame him.
I find that quite difficult to, well, A, I find it difficult to stomach, and B, I find it difficult to believe. Because actually, what has FIFA got out of this? Previous World Cups, a match ticket got you a visa. Well, that's absolutely not the case here. Previous tournaments, FIFA was not taxed. The prize money was not taxed. Now it absolutely is taxed. So I'm not really sure what concessions Infantino's got out of Trump for this sycophancy. Which leads you to the other conclusion, which is Infantino just likes being around powerful men. He certainly cozied up to Putin and to Mohammed bin Salman and the Emir of Qatar. I think he likes the fact that he turns up at the the peace board. He was at the Gaza peace talks in Sharm el Sheikh. I mean, why? Why is the head of football? Why is the head of any sport turning up at the Gaza peace talks? He's become the equivalent of a medieval pope. He's got no territory, but he's somehow got this great political power, which is quite hard to define if you actually think about it. If you just stop believing in Catholicism, the pope doesn't matter. If you stop believing that football suddenly has this sort of great healing energy, then Infantino has no power. So I suspect he just sort of likes being with his mate, the President of the United States.
FIFA began on the idea that football could bring people together, an idea that, ostensibly at least, their president still believed. And he appears to believe it so strongly that he's making decisions, often unilaterally, with the assumption that football can make almost anything feel small by comparison. Things like geographical borders, or gender inequality, or human rights abuses, or even war. Is the World Cup for peace? Infantino seems to think so. The idea that football could help bring the world together has been around since the days of Rimet, but the current president of FIFA is taking it to some really weird extremes. He recently made an attempt to get the presidents of the Palestinian FA and the Israeli FA to shake hands on stage at the FIFA Congress, which went about as well as you might expect. He also famously awarded the inaugural FIFA Peace Prize to Donald Trump, an award whose purpose is to, quote, reward individuals who have taken exceptional and extraordinary actions for peace, and by doing so, have united people across the world. And he's also been incredibly bullish on Iran's ability to participate in the World Cup without any issues whatsoever.
And let me start by the outset, or at the outset, I should say, confirming straight away for those who maybe want to say something else or want to write something else, that, of course, Iran will be participating at the FIFA World Cup 2026. And the reason for that is very simple, dear friends, is because we have to unite. We have to bring people together. It is my responsibility, it is our responsibility. Football unites the world, FIFA unites the world, you unite the world, we unite the world.
So a couple of things on that. First, on Iran and the US specifically, I think Infantino has put himself in a bit of an ideological twist. Because while his proximity to Trump, which we talked about earlier, doesn't confirm that he's favoring one of his member nations over another in an armed conflict, it certainly doesn't not make it look like that. Like, if peace was truly the priority, he would have made a bigger deal about what the US was doing, probably all the way back in 2025, when the conflict started. But he's definitely not doing that. How could he, after all of these very public displays of admiration for Trump? But the second idea there is that football somehow has the ability to just wave a magic wand and make everybody get along. Which it just doesn't, and never has. The first World Cup in 1930 was relatively harmonious, but just 4 years later, things were already headed in a very different geopolitical direction. And instead of being a force to stop that, or even to slow it down, the World Cup in 1934 in Italy was right in the middle of it, being used as a tool.
The tone by 34 is completely different. That Mussolini has recognized how useful the World Cup can be for him in two ways. So the first way is, if Italy win, then it proves Italy are this modern, successful, thrusting, athletic, vigorous nation, which fits his vision of fascism. And also, if it hosts well, then the stereotype of Italy as being this sort of grubby little backwater of Europe where everything's a bit chaotic and they can't organise anything. Well, you get rid of that and you say, look, we have trains that run on time, stereotypically. You have great stadiums, and stadiums have been, it's been a project of building stadiums from 1926 onwards in Italy. And Mussolini is so convinced that Italy is a great modern nation that he subsidises travel to Italy for foreign fans. He subsidises travel between cities, between host cities. You get the first, certainly in Europe, first sort of sports marketing, where you can buy your World Cup and fascist branded memorabilia from the World Cup. Very much the vibe is, come to Italy, see how brilliant we are, go home and tell everybody how great we are. And you see that in the fascist papers. They're scanning the foreign press. Any snippet of praise for Italy during that period is reported in the fascist newspapers.
Yeah, we will come back to right-wing leaders sort of interjecting themselves into the World Cup branding.
Well, I mean, thank God we're past that now.
Yeah, I know, right?
All joking aside, the intermingling of the World Cup and conflicts happening around the world did not stop with Mussolini. In 1938, Germany fielded players from the Austrian national team because they had annexed it a few months before. There weren't any World Cups between 1938 and 1950 because of World War II, which kind of tells its own story. The tournament in 1978 was played in Argentina, who at that time was under the control of a military junta, who were disappearing people just a few miles away from where the matches were being played. My point is that not only does football not have the power to supersede geopolitical issues, it can actually focus people's attention on them. Take the 1998 World Cup, for instance, when the US and Iran played each other in the group stage. That wasn't even during an active conflict, but because of the historical relationship between the two countries, it became one of the biggest stories of the entire tournament, between two teams who didn't even make it out of their group. Despite FIFA claiming it as a big victory for peace, in the background there was enhanced security and anti-regime protests and orders from the Iranian government for their team to not approach the American players before kickoff. It may not have devolved into the full-on crisis that some people expected it to, but nearly 30 years later, I think we can all agree that that one game taking place didn't really do a whole lot to improve US-Iranian relations in a meaningful way. And where that relationship is now in 2026 is way more likely to affect the outcome of this tournament than anything going in the other direction.
No real sign that the conflict in Iran is stopping. Maybe it will. But even if it does, the impact on oil prices, food prices will go on. If Iran and the US both finish second in their group, they play each other in the second round, which would be, the biggest of all stories. I think there will be an instinct to move the attention to the football, but in practical terms, I think there's a lot of reasons why that won't be as straightforward this time.
No matter how much FIFA wants it to be, the World Cup hasn't been about peace for a long time. I think that really meant something to a man like Rimet, who fought in a war and had a much more clear-eyed understanding of what football could do in response. Current FIFA does not have that same level of understanding. They're happy to remind everyone that they have more member countries than the United Nations, but then seem very reluctant to rise to the level of responsibility or accountability that organizations like that absolutely have to. FIFA kind of wants to have their cake and eat it too. There's a delicate line between fostering acceptance and togetherness and tacitly endorsing some really questionable beliefs and behaviors, which FIFA has always had issues with navigating. But current FIFA has a very annoying habit of pretending that line doesn't exist, which makes me wonder, is it really peace they're trying to protect, or is it something else?
It was pretty well understood that what FIFA's after is whatever market can sort of produce the most revenue from this tournament, right? Because the way FIFA is structured is that the overwhelming majority of its income comes from World Cups. They have a 4-year cycle where they need to sustain the contributions that they pay out to their 211 member nations. And the World Cup is the engine that drives those finances.
So there are probably at least a few of you watching this and thinking he is making this entirely too complicated. The World Cup is pretty obviously about one thing, and that's money. And that's true, but probably not in the way that you're thinking. Because FIFA is a non-profit organization, which in this case means that any profit FIFA makes goes directly into funding its member countries, staging tournaments and paying their staff, among other things. And the one thing they have to sell to realistically make all that happen is the World Cup, which as an asset is kind of the perfect storm. There's only one World Cup, so supply is super low, there's no real competitor for it, and it only comes around once every 4 years. Which means that FIFA can charge basically whatever they want, and people will still pay it. But the question is, should FIFA be doing that? This is one of the most controversial questions of this entire World Cup cycle, and I did not feel entirely qualified to take it on my own. So I did the logical thing, if you ever have a question about economics, and I asked an economist. Stefan Szymański is a sports economist and professor, and one of the authors of Soccernomics, which is widely regarded as one of the best football books of all time. And when trying to understand the way that FIFA makes and manages its money, there's one idea that I want to highlight from that conversation.
What we're talking about is a transaction where you have a monopoly seller of tickets and you have, a huge number of potential customers, many of whom are willing to pay vast prices. The monopolist will maximize its profit by essentially selling to every single customer at their willingness to pay. So some people are willing to pay thousands of dollars, some people are willing to pay hundreds, some people are only willing to pay 10. They've designed the auction scheme for selling tickets so that they can capture those who are willing to pay thousands, sell, if you're not willing to pay thousands, sell to you at hundreds, and if you're only willing to pay 10, forget it, they're not interested.
Imagine if instead of selling soccer, FIFA sold donuts. Those donuts would first of all be amazing, but they would only be available once every 4 years. And most importantly, there are no donut companies in the world that can realistically compete with them. Even if it is kind of by default, FIFA is a monopoly. But that's not really the biggest problem here.
Monopolies are good in some sense. Take your donut seller. If your donuts are really great, then we should be quite happy to pay you a high price for your high quality donuts because you're delivering something to us as consumers that we want. The problem comes when you, as the donut seller, the original donut seller, create barriers. Maybe, for example, you say, well, if you buy donuts from them, I'm never going to allow you to buy another donut from me.
Monopolies like FIFA aren't illegal. They're not even always bad. There are lots of what are called natural monopolies, like many public utilities, where it wouldn't make any sense to get a bunch of different organizations involved. Monopolization, however, is illegal, because that's doing things to defend a monopoly in a way that doesn't have any actual benefit to the consumer.
So if you think about FIFA from that perspective, is FIFA monopolizing the World Cup? Well, why couldn't we set up our own rival World Cup and invite all the other national associations to come and join in that competition? The problem with that would be that people would then say, if those players come and play for your competition, they cannot ever play anywhere within the FIFA organization. Not only can they not play within the World Cup, they can never play for their national teams. And indeed, they can never, if the national associations go within this, they can't even play for their clubs in their home countries. That's the threat that maintains the monopoly power of FIFA. So in that sense, if you're upset about FIFA, it's the monopolization that you should be upset with.
This is why we have antitrust laws, but in FIFA's case, who would even enforce those? There's no worldwide super government or even an independent regulator that would have the power to make them stop if they did anything untoward. Or more untoward, I guess. At this point, FIFA is sort of ungovernable, and if we're having a conversation about FIFA and money, that's the biggest issue at this point. The only real incentive they have to play by the rules, and not their own rules, is because they think it's the right thing to do, and at this point, that does not seem very likely. And there's no better example of that than how they treated the hosts of the World Cup in 2010 and 2014.
South Africa and Brazil are so desperate to host the tournament that FIFA ripped them off. They change the regulations and say, look, actually, we're going to turn up. You're going to build all this stuff. That's just your cost. And we're going to take all these revenues from ticket sales, from sponsorship, from marketing, all the commercial revenues. We're going to take almost all of that. And when we've gone, you're going to have to pay for the upkeep of all of these stadiums, all this infrastructure. And also, we don't think you should tax us either. And South Africa and Brazil went along with that.
It's not just about the amount of money being made, which I think a lot of people get hung up on. It's about what that money represents. When you're the biggest game in town, or even the only game in town, you can kind of do what you want, including gaslight people into thinking that World Cups generate a bunch of money for the hosts, which, as South Africa and Brazil found out the hard way, and Stefan confirmed to me, is not a thing.
There are literally dozens and dozens of, peer-reviewed research articles on this subject. And it's one of the few things on which economists agree. We don't agree on very much, but we all pretty much agree that there is next to no economic benefit to hosting any of these major events. Roughly speaking, the evidence suggests that the economic impact of hosting these mega events is either slightly positive or slightly negative. In either case, it's like a rounding error in the national income account. So it's something you can just forget about.
So if the cost of getting the World Cup to your country is selling your soul to this organization, often at the expense of your own fans, and that country doesn't even then get to enjoy the financial rewards off the back of it, why are all of these federations falling all over themselves to get this tournament? Like, is that what the World Cup is for? Getting ripped off? Why does anyone want this thing?
The way to think of this is it's a big party. And if I'd expect you had held parties of your own in the past. Did you ever think you were going to make money out of hosting a party? No, it never crossed your mind. You knew you were going to cost you to have a party. But that didn't matter. You still went on and had the party because having parties is fun. Hosting parties is a fun thing to do.
Lots of people think that the World Cup is about making money, at least in part because of the amount that the tournament itself will generate, and because people like Gianni Infantino and Donald Trump have said things to that exact effect. But the money doesn't stay with the people who host the party. Almost all of it goes somewhere else, along with most of the agency over who actually gets to attend.
I think what you're going to see, unfortunately, at this World Cup is that it will be attended by a lot of stockbrokers and dentists and, executives and car dealership owners and whatever. And that you're, in that sense, vibes-wise, it'll be much closer to the Super Bowl, right? Which is not usually where you see a huge amount of the hardcore fans because they can't afford to go.
By most accounts, this is going to be the most attended World Cup of all time, and should comfortably surpass the previous record of more than 3.5 million fans at the tournament in 1994. But what will the experience for those fans actually be like? Well, we can't really answer that fully yet because the tournament hasn't happened. I do think Leander has a point about the kinds of fans that will be able to make it to games, which we'll come back to. But if the fan experience up to this point is anything to go by, I think we might be in for a bit of a bumpy ride. First, we've got to talk about tickets. Here's a perspective that I found enlightening. In May 2026, Guardian Football Weekly talked about how the ticketing process for this World Cup is kind of the worst of both the American and the European ticketing systems. Ticket pricing for this World Cup is dynamic, which means that the cost of the ticket changes along with what the market is doing. So you never really know what the ticket will or even should cost. But they're also using the category system, which for Americans like me, who are used to choosing the exact seat that they want to sit in a given game, is kind of weird. And it might be easier to stomach all that if tickets were cheap and easy to access. But they are neither. Yahoo Sports had the average cost of a ticket to this World Cup at between $1,500 and $2,000, which might be doable for most people as a kind of once-in-a-lifetime experience, like going to Disney World or something, but as just a casual thing that you roll out on a Tuesday afternoon and go do is almost impossible. There are tickets that are going for cheaper than that, but likely not for a game that you're actually interested in. And if you factor in paying for a hotel or traveling across the country or even the world, you start to see how accessibility to the world's game could become a real problem for most of the world. And look, most of the things we've talked about up to this point are not things that I will have to deal with personally. Like, I don't really understand why Donald Trump was on the field at the Club World Cup. Thought it was kind of weird, but it didn't have any bearing on my actual life. It makes me very sad that there are travel bans in place that would prevent fans of certain countries from coming to watch their team play. But if my accent didn't give this away already, I'm not from one of those countries, so it doesn't really affect me directly. But ticketing does. And in that scenario, I'm not just someone looking in from the outside. I'm a case study, because earlier this year, I became one of likely several million people who will purchase a ticket to the 2026 World Cup. And I'm very excited to be able to use it to go to a game, but it was not cheap. If I were to take the same amount of money that I spent on that ticket and decided that I wanted to go to the Braves game happening across town the same day, I could sit in the lowest tier of Truist Park, right behind home plate. And that's for Czechia against South Africa, where I don't particularly care about either of the teams, and have a seat in one of the sections that's furthest away from the field. And I can only afford that because I'm in my 30s and have a job and a mortgage and happen to live close to a host city with a banging transit system, and I have a free place to stay. If any one of those things weren't true, which it won't be for a huge percentage of the people who want to come to the World Cup, the likelihood of me being able to go to a World Cup game in my home country would have dropped significantly. I am baffled by how inaccessible this tournament has become. And the frustrating part is that it didn't have to be this way. From a US soccer perspective, I think this is a really huge opportunity for fan engagement in this country that we might be about to blow. I would argue that seeing teams and their players in person performing well gives people a natural entry point to soccer. Because they can say, hey, I remember him. That's Moises Caicedo. I watched him play against Curacao in Kansas City. What a sentence that is, by the way. Call me old-fashioned, but I think there's a lot of value in people being able to walk up to a stadium and go to a game, which almost no one is going to be able to do at this tournament, no matter what country you live in. And I think that's a pretty big problem.
I don't think we should be ashamed at all of celebrating the beauty that Messi creates, the beauty that Argentina creates, the feelings that the drama of the occasion evoke in us. All of that is true. At the same time, it is true that was a disgusting tournament which had never been staged. And every time you walked into a stadium, a press centre, got on the metro, went to a mall, went to a hotel, you knew the human cost of building that. You knew that not just the deaths, but just the misery of the conditions in which people had worked to build that. And both of those things are true.
Over the next month or so, I think you're going to hear a lot of people saying things like, the World Cup is broken. But it isn't. It has always had these two realities, purity and profitability, as a part of its identity. And yes, for all the reasons we've just talked about, one of them does appear to be more dominant right now. But that doesn't mean that the other one isn't there. Like Jonathan said, it can be both. Everyone we've talked to and everything we've looked at has pointed to the same truth about the World Cup. There's good and bad. There's a lot of light, but there's also so much darkness at this point that it can be kind of hard to see, which is why there's so much apathy and confusion right now about why we're still doing this in 2026. But that doesn't mean that the light isn't there. And as we transition into this World Cup specifically, I think everyone is going to need to remember that. For a long time, the US especially has been framing this tournament as a kind of culmination of how far the game has come in this country. For so long, 2026 was held up as this turning point that we've been building to, but now that we're here, all I can think is that we might have fallen into the same trap that a lot of other host nations have. I've been referring to this tournament as the White House ballroom of World Cups, which might not make a ton of sense for our viewers outside of the US, but in summary, Trump knocked down a big chunk of the White House to build a massive ballroom that's going to cost something like $400 million. He and the people close to him have been pushing it pretty hard, but to most average Americans, it also seems kind of unnecessary and expensive and pretty poorly timed considering everything else that's going on here right now. But going through all of these potential reasons for the World Cup made me realize that people have been using the World Cup for a specific purpose, usually their own purposes, since the very beginning. But what if the purpose of the World Cup is the World Cup? What if that purpose is self-evident and all these other things we've been talking about are byproducts rather than being reasons for existing. Think back to what I started this video with, that joyful feeling of watching the final in 2022. The moment before we all had to consider what it all meant or think about what was going to come next. How do we create more of that? I don't know, but I'm down to try and find out. The World Cup has gone the way of lots of other good things that have been corrupted by some combination of corporate and political interest. But the thing that Rime initially envisioned, the thing we all think of when we hear the World Cup, is still in there somewhere. That version of the World Cup isn't for anything, because it doesn't serve any one interest or one purpose. But that doesn't mean that it doesn't have a purpose. And in part 2 of this video, because pretty quickly I realized that there was going to need to be a part 2, I am going to go personally in search of that purpose. Like I said earlier, I bought a ticket to go see Czechia play South Africa on June 18th in Atlanta, and I am super excited about it. There's only one real way to find out what the World Cup is going to be like, and why we still enjoy it and think it's great despite of all this other stuff, and that's to go. So the next time you see me, that's where I'll be. To the World Cup! Hey guys, welcome to my couch/makeshift edit bay where I have just successfully completed editing this video, which you have successfully made it all the way to the end of, so thank you and congratulations. I'm so incredibly grateful to all 3 of the people that appeared in this video. They were all incredibly generous with their time, and it was their expertise and their insight that really turned this into something that I'm really proud of. There are links in the description to both The Power and the Glory by Jonathan Wilson and The Long Game by Leander Sherlakens, as well as a link to the Soccernomics podcast, which Stefan Szymański is also a part of. Again, thank you guys so much for watching. Thank you to everybody who participated in the video, and I will see you guys in a few weeks for part 2.